Cindy and James Green are in a room with the U.S. Adoption Services. Looking over the paperwork, the agent notices that they didn't fill out one space, asking what makes them qualified. Another section asks what made them prepared for this responsibility. They simply wrote Timothy. The agent tells them they need to put everything on the table. They agree and tell their story of Timothy Green. Last September, the Greens had been trying for a baby. They received the news that they've exhausted every medical option available to them. They drive home, heartbroken, and return to their lives. A woman hangs a sign indicating that the pencil factory is on the brink of closure. James goes back to work at the pencil factory, and Cindy to her job at the pencil museum. While James cooks dinner, he hears the calls from Cindy's sister, Brenda, about the family lunch the next day. James sadly watches his wife gardening. Later, he finds her in their baby room. She tells him they're moving on. James joins her in the living room and tells Cindy he can't move on. He tells her that just for tonight, they could have a kid. She brings up what the doctor said before telling James to give up. James gets excited, pulls out a notepad and writes that their kid would never give up. Cindy asks him to stop. James continues to say their kid would have Cindy's big heart. When Cindy tells him that it's not funny, he tells her their kid would be funny. Cindy joins in, and James hands her the notepad and pencil. James gets wine, and they continue to come up with the kid of their dreams. Someone honest, imperfect, but theirs. They keep coming up with things. Artist, rock star, gets his moment to score the winning goal. They pretend to see the child right in front of them, excited before realizing it's a fantasy. Cindy gathers the papers and reviews them before James grabs a box. Then they go out to the garden and bury the box, hoping that by morning they'll be ready to move on with their lives. But as soon as they sleep that night, the wind picks up, and the rain begins to fall around their home and garden. While Cindy and James sleep, the spot where the box is buried begins to grow. The two wake up to a crack of thunder. James walks downstairs to stop a door banging in the wind. The rain stops and goes back up into the sky. James grabs something from the fridge as something runs past. He drinks some milk and goes back up to bed. He climbs in and talks to Cindy, telling her everything's going to be all right. Cindy opens the bathroom door and asks if James said anything, and they realize someone's in their bed. As the figure runs away, they look in bed and see dirt covering Cindy's side. They run around the house, finding a boy in their baby room. Cinema recap here. We've got a little challenge that'll take 5 seconds, and it will change your life forever. You ready? All you gotta do is like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, and you'll receive 10 free years of good luck. It's as simple as that. Rummaging through the boxes, Cindy and James walk up to the boy, who says hello and introduces himself as Timothy. She runs the bath while James calls 911. While he tries to find the words to explain his situation, he looks outside and drops the call. Cindy dries Timothy off and she notices something on his legs. James runs up the stair calling out for Cindy. She shows James the leaves growing from Timothy's legs. Timothy asks them not to ask about him. They look at them up close and Cindy touches the leaves. James tells Cindy that she has to go and look out back. When Cindy does, she sees the spot where the box was buried is now a hole with notes of their child scattered around. Inside, Cindy dresses Timothy before they go to make him some food. Cindy says that Timothy can call them Cindy and Jim, but Timothy calls them Mom and Dad. The two go and speak in private. They reveal that out of 54 names, Timothy was the only boy on the list of potential baby names. When they go back into the kitchen, they find Timothy asleep. James carries him to bed. They put him in their bed and lay down next to him, confused, but happy. The next day, Timothy wakes up to the sound of knocking at the door. Outside is Brenda and the family. Timothy opens the door and greets her, which surprises Brenda. Cindy and Jim wake up and realize that Timothy's talking to someone, so they rush downstairs and grab Timothy. Cindy closes the door on Brenda before going to James and Timothy. James takes off his socks and Cindy puts them on Timothy, asking him to keep the details of the garden and his leaves secret. James goes and tells the family about Timothy but doesn't reveal much. Brenda questions why Cindy never told her anything, but Cindy just tells her it was sudden. After some snide remarks from Brenda, Cindy leaves to go and join James and Timothy at the grill. Cindy sees James's dad pull up and asks who invited him. James tells her he didn't think his father would show up. Timothy runs and greets Big Jim, putting him on the spot when he calls him Grandpa. Cindy introduces Timothy to the rest of the family, who instantly fall in love with him. Most of them anyways. Big Jim starts a game of dodgeball, and Cindy and James try to tell Timothy how to play, but he doesn't get it. James tries to help Timothy, but he gets into a fight with his father. Brenda continues making snide remarks about Timothy having issues, and as the sun emerges from behind the clouds, Timothy stops and soaks up the sun, leaving everyone confused. He stops when a girl, Joni, on a bike rides past the Greens' home. Big Jim hits him over the head with a ball. Cindy invites her friend Reggie to come and help take Timothy's leaves off. They try to explain why they want to cut him off, and to their surprise, he says they can go for it. Reggie takes the shears to the leaves, but they break instantly. He looks at Timothy, who confirms that it's not going to work. They take him to school, and Cindy goes to work in a good mood. Her boss Bernice tells Cindy she was late, has a stain on her clothes, and is annoyingly cheerful. When Cindy tries to explain, Bernice tells her she doesn't care. As Bernice leaves, Cindy gets a call. While at work, James and his coworkers are told that either there will be limited layoffs and reduced hours or the whole factory will close. James gets a call interrupting the meeting. He answers the call, and the two go to the school and find Timothy covered in food, but refusing to say who did it. James tells Timothy to tell him who did it so he can handle it. James goes to the house of Timothy's bully and confronts the father, his boss. The mother of the bully invites Timothy to come to their kid's birthday party, which Timothy is very excited about. At the party, Timothy sees Joni before he jumps into the pool and sinks to the bottom. He remains underwater for a while before Joni goes in to fetch him. At the bottom of the pool, Joni tries to take Timothy's socks off, causing Timothy to accidentally kick her in the face. They both get to the surface and everyone stares at him. On the way home, Timothy tells that Joni tried to take off his socks, causing him to panic that she saw the leaves. Joni chases after Timothy in the forest, telling him she knows what she saw. She forces Timothy to look at a mark on her collarbone. The two go around town collecting random things and riding around. Cindy sees Timothy on the bike with Joni riding past. Cindy calls James and tells him that Timothy's too young to have a crush on a girl. Joni takes Timothy home before leaving while Timothy celebrates. He's interrupted when one of his leaves falls off. He runs inside and puts the leaf into a homemade envelope. The Greens tell the agent that they plan to have the talk with Timothy, but the plan is derailed when Cindy finds out Uncle Bob is in the hospital. They go to see Uncle Bob. After a few moments of talking and laughing, they all leave the room, but Uncle Bob asks if Timothy can stay. Cindy soon tells James to get Timothy, but Aunt Mel stops him. They look inside and see Uncle Bob laughing with Timothy. Aunt Mel gets emotional, saying she never thought she'd hear that laugh again. While they talk and joke around, another leaf falls from Timothy's jeans. While laughing, Uncle Bob crashes, and Timothy's taken from the room as nurses and doctors rush in. Timothy hides the leaf. They take Timothy to tryouts for soccer. The coach immediately says no, but Cindy and James ask him to reconsider to make some friends. The coach reluctantly agrees. At practice, Timothy is less than great at the game, failing to even kick the ball. As the coach makes them run around, Cindy and James notice Timothy running with Joni as she rides next to him on her bike. Later, they practice at home and talk to Timothy about Joni. Finally, Timothy kicks the ball to James and they all celebrate. Things get troublesome at work when James is forced to lay off people. That night at dinner, James isn't in the mood and leaves the dinner table. Cindy and Timothy try to cheer him up and have a picnic in the living room. James shows Timothy his book of ideas. When he reflects on how the factory might close and he might not be making pencils anymore, Timothy asks why he doesn't just make a new kind of pencil. James and Cindy spend nights and days trying to come up with ideas for their new pencil. They don't think they can do it, but they want to set an example for Timothy. Meanwhile, Timothy and Joni continue to spend more time together. In the end, James and Cindy successfully make the pencil. At Bring Your Kid to Work Day, Timothy meets Bernice. She's looking at a portrait of herself that's just been unveiled, and she asks Timothy what he thinks. He says not much. Bernice tells him that it was an expensive piece, and Timothy tells her he'd do it for free. She asks if he really believes he can do a better job, and Timothy calmly says he can try. Bernice gives Timothy some pencils to work with. Timothy removes Bernice's glasses and lets her hair down. While drawing her, Timothy notices the hairs on her chin and draws them in. Another leaf falls off of Timothy as Cindy walks in. She admires the drawing until she sees the hair Timothy drew on her chin. Cindy tries to get him to erase them before Bernice stands and grabs it from him. She notices the hairs and calls in everyone who works at the museum, asking what else they haven't told her. Timothy tells Cindy to be honest, so Cindy starts small before she lets loose. The story is cut short when James tells the agent that Cindy lost her job that day. Timothy goes and joins James in the factory. Because of Timothy, James feels like anything is possible. and so he goes to pitch the pencil they created to his boss. Timothy watches as James tries to explain the pencil to Franklin, but he's dismissive, and so James leaves the pencil and walks out. At the first game of the season, Cindy sits with Brenda on the stands. James stands to the side as Big Jim comes around the corner. Big Jim is condescending, calling Timothy a water boy while James fights back. Cindy and James tell the agent that they felt like Timothy wasn't telling them something, and they were worried about all the time he was spending with Joni. Cindy seeks out Joni and follows her into the woods. Cindy tells Joni that she doesn't want him to get hurt by her, but Joni isn't fazed. Cindy continues following Joni and comes across what the two have been working on this whole time. She's shocked and happy, knowing she was wrong about Joni this entire time. At another soccer game, James asks the coach to put Timothy in the game. Cindy asks what's going on, and then James shows her father in the corner, watching judgmentally. Brenda talks to Cindy and is condescending, belittling Cindy's art, bragging about her kids and life. When Cindy tries to say Timothy is gifted, the things she lists don't impress Brenda. Cindy snaps and tells Brenda that Timothy is musical. Later, they attend Brenda's home for her annual music showcase for her children. Brenda tells the family that instead of the family doing an encore, Timothy will perform. Timothy goes to each instrument to see what he's good at, but chooses a cowbell. James, seeing that Timothy's struggling, jumps up and joins in, and quickly Cindy joins in too. After tucking Timothy in that night, Cindy and James realize that Timothy will score the winning goal and are excited about the game. Meanwhile, Timothy looks at another dead leaf. At the game, James tells his dad to stay, and Big Jim reluctantly agrees. During the game, James tries to convince the coach to let Timothy play. The game drags on, and Timothy still hasn't been put in. Joni arrives, and after another goal from the other team, an injury forces the coach's hand. Timothy's in the game. Everyone groans at the idea of Timothy playing, while Cindy and James know what's coming. Coach tries to get Timothy to stay in place, but James tells him to ignore the coach and move around. Joni waves at Timothy, and as the sun comes out, he soaks in the sun. Timothy looks at Joni, who holds up a sign and wears his player number. The ball comes to Timothy, and even though the coach tries to stop him, he plays. Timothy's doing really well, to everyone's surprise. Timothy ends up scoring the winning goal for the other team. At home, James and Cindy fight while Timothy finds yet another dead leaf. Timothy walks in and tells them to stop. As Timothy tries to tell them something, the agent interrupts the Greens' story and tells them they're out of time. Cindy and James say they're not leaving until they tell the whole story. She allows them to go on. At a school prize giving, Timothy introduces Cindy and James to Joni. The two walk outside and initially Cindy says, "Let them be." But they quickly backtrack and go after Timothy. Outside, Timothy tries to tell Cindy the truth about him, and they watch on. She starts crying, and as Timothy walks away, Joni runs after him and hugs him. Timothy walks back to him and tells them that he likes Joni, but they're confused because it looks like they just broke up. But he explains he let her go. They ask why he would do that, and Timothy tells them that they wouldn't understand. Cindy and James say to the agent that he was right. They didn't get it, but they were about to. At a town meeting, they discuss the factory closing. Just as the discussion is heating up, the factory owner pulls out James and Cindy's pencil, calling it a miracle. James's boss takes all the credit. Timothy goes up onto the stage and outs James's boss, saying that his parents created it. James's boss starts making fun of Timothy. James stands up for Timothy as Big Jim watches. He tells Franklin that he'll have to deal with him if he makes fun of Timothy. Big Jim chimes in, saying Franklin would have to deal with him too. Bernice stands and asks how they came up with a pencil made from leaves, all the while looking at the Greens before she turns the question over to Franklin. He fails to answer the question. The Greens answer it, and in doing so, have to expose Timothy's leaves. But while there is a leaf to prove their point, they notice only one remains. On the way home, they ask what happened to his leaves. Timothy refuses to tell them as a storm comes in. They go inside, and Timothy tells them that he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything they could do. Cindy realizes when the leaves go. So does Timothy. They ask how long, and Timothy looks down, and the last leaf falls. Cindy and James cry as they go and hug him. The lights go out, and Timothy's gone. They run out and look for the box. They look inside and cry. The agent asks what was in the box, and inside was a note from Timothy. The agent reads it before leaving. The letter tells of how Timothy gave his leaves to different people. Aunt Brenda, Uncle Bob, Bernice, Coach, Reggie, Big Jim, Joni, James, and Cindy. Finally, a few months have passed, and the agents bring the Greens a daughter. They walk with Lily into their home, a new happy family. The Odd Life of Timothy Green was released in 2012 by Walt Disney Studios. It starred Jennifer Garner, Joel Edgerton, and C.J. Adams. How would you react if a child suddenly came into your life? Tell me with the hashtag Cinema Recap in the comments.